All right, everyone, get ready for today's deep dive. We're about to tackle a topic that's a little bit spicy, a little bit personal. We're talking all about men's preferences when it comes to, you guessed it, pubic hair.
Ooh, yeah, we're going there.
And this deep dive is inspired by a Reddit post that asked the very straightforward question, bush or no bush?
And let me tell you, that simple question sparked a whole whirlwind of opinions and some pretty entertaining comments, too, gotta say.
Oh, absolutely. And, we love to unpack those layers, go beyond just the surface level. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the why behind the preferences, the reasoning, the cultural influences, maybe even uncover some psychological insights along the way. What'd you say?
Sounds like a plan. And just to kick things off right away, gotta acknowledge the obvious men's preferences. Well, they're not a single uniform thing.
Right, definitely not.
We're seeing a whole spectrum of opinions emerge from the responses. Some guys are firmly in the pro-Bush camp, others are advocating for a smooth, landscape, and then there's a whole bunch who fall somewhere in between.
Okay, so let's start with Team Bush. What is it about the more natural look that appeals to some men?
Well, a lot of guys, they find beauty in the natural state. They see pubic hair as something that's inherently feminine, a sign of maturity. And for some, it's a source of visual appeal.
That's interesting. So it's not just about the look, right? Some men even suggested that pubic hair can actually enhance the sensation during intimacy for both partners.
Yeah, that came up a few times. Some find that the texture adds a different dimension to the sensory experience, almost like an added layer of stimulation.
Huh, interesting. And then there's that psychological aspect that we see in some responses. Some men express discomfort with a completely hairless pubic area. They associate it with a prepubescent look, and that can feel, well, jarring or even a little unsettling.
Right, it's like a subconscious association, maybe something they're not even fully aware of, that triggers a negative response.
Okay, so that's Team Bush. Now let's flip the script. We got Team Smooth. What are the driving forces behind their preference for a hairless look?
Practicality is a big one. A lot of men mentioned ease of access during intimate moments, especially for oral sex.
Makes sense, less to navigate,
Yeah, exactly. They find it feels cleaner, less cumbersome.
right? And speaking of clean, hygiene also came up quite a bit, although whether a smooth style is actually more hygienic, well, that's debatable.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's more about personal preference and good hygiene practices overall than any inherent advantage of one style over the other.
So it's not a clear-cut case, more of a personal thing.
Right. Pubic hair can trap sweat and bacteria, sure, but removing it can lead to irritation and ingrown hairs, which can then increase the risk of infection. It's a trade-off.
So as with so many things, personal preference reigns supreme. And for some men, that preference is simply for the sleek aesthetic of a smooth pubic area. They just find a more visually appealing, end of story.
Absolutely. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And that applies to every part of our bodies.
Definitely. And what about those who prefer, well, a little bit of both? The trim and tidy enthusiasts, the ones who fall somewhere in the middle ground.
Yeah, this seems to be a popular compromise, a way to balance the natural look with a more groomed aesthetic. So, a landing strip, a neatly trimmed triangle, just a general tidying up.
Right, so it allows for some personal expression while keeping things, well, manageable.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, no matter what men's preferences might be, ultimately a woman's body is her own.
Absolutely, 100%.
Her comfort, her confidence, those should always be the top priority.
100% agree. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork with the main camps of preferences, but I gotta say, some of those comments in that Reddit thread were hilarious, really colorful anecdotes. One guy compared a full book to smuggling Weird Al Yankovic down there. I mean, come on.
Yeah, some of those were pretty out there. I guess when you're talking about these, well, potentially awkward topics, humor is a way to kind of diffuse the tension.
Right, it makes it more approachable.
Makes you feel like you're not alone in, having those thoughts.
Definitely. And another comment that stuck with me, someone said their girlfriend's pubic hair was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Now, I'm not sure if that's endearing or terrifying.
Maybe a bit of both, but it does highlight that element of surprise, the unexpectedness that can be part of the experience.
For sure. And hey, speaking of surprises, we can't forget the guy who compared his partner's stubble to, get this, a cactus.
Ouch. Sounds prickly.
Yeah, definitely not a fan of the stubble stage. These anecdotes, they're funny, but they also remind us of how important communication is in a relationship.
Right. What works for one person might be a total no-go for someone else, so you got to talk about it.
Exactly. And speaking of being open, we love hearing from you, our listeners. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, head over to our YouTube channel, Shauna Poolage, and leave a comment. Let us know what's resonating with you, what you're thinking.
We're always eager to have thoughtful conversations and hear different perspectives. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to Voices of the Soul for more deep dives like this one.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our exploration, there's one more layer we need to peel back. The role of generational differences in shaping these preferences. It seems like some older men who grew up before pubic hair removal became so, I don't know, widespread, they have a stronger preference for a natural bush.
That's a really interesting observation. It suggests that cultural norms, they play a huge role in shaping our perceptions of beauty and what we find attractive. What was once the norm can become almost taboo in a matter of decades.
It's wild how much things can change. So, with all these different perspectives and influences swirling around, where does this leave us? What can we actually say about men's preferences for pubic hair styles?
I think the key takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right, of course.
Preferences are so diverse. They're influenced by individual tastes, cultural backgrounds, personal experiences, and even the dynamics of a specific relationship. It's complicated.
It is. It's about understanding that complexity and recognizing that there's no right or wrong answer. And as we move into part two of this deep dive, we're going to explore how those cultural and societal forces have actually shaped these preferences over time. Get ready to dig into the history of pubic hair removal.
And the influence of media and pornography and the pressures women face to conform to certain beauty standards, it's going to be juicy.
Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Voices of the Soul. We're picking right back up with our exploration of men's pubic hair preferences. And like we promised, we're going to dig a little deeper into the historical and cultural side of things. Like, where did all this even come from?
Yeah, let's rewind the clock a bit. When did this whole idea of removing pubic hair even become a thing? Was it always part of, human history? Or is this something more recent, a modern trend?
It's actually, well, you might be surprised to learn that it's not just a modern thing at all. The practice of removing body hair, and that includes pubic hair, it goes back centuries, like way back.
Really? No way. I had no idea. Tell me more. I'm intrigued now.
Okay, so for example, in ancient Egypt, both men and women, they removed body hair. And yeah, that included pubic hair for hygiene and aesthetics. They used techniques like sugaring and beeswax, stuff that's still popular even today.
Wow, so the quest for a smooth look, it's been going on for a long, long time. But I imagine the reasons for it and the methods they use, they've probably evolved over time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Throughout history, pubic hair removal, it's kind of gone through these phases of popularity and then obscurity, like in and out of fashion. And it was influenced by all sorts of things, from religious beliefs to social customs. So, for example, in some cultures, pubic hair, it was seen as like a symbol of fertility, womanhood. But then in other cultures, it was considered like unclean or even, totally taboo.
Wow, so many different perspectives. So when did this current trend of pubic hair removal, the one we're all familiar with today, when did it really take off? Like, was there a specific moment, a turning point?
The 1990s seemed to be a pretty big turning point. The rise of Brazilian waxing and then also just more at-home hair removal products became available, made it more accessible, and I guess you could say more mainstream. It went from something that was maybe, whispered about in salons to just a regular part of many women's beauty routines.
Yeah, I think we got to acknowledge the influence of media and pornography too, right? Especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Like, so much of the imagery we were exposed to featured women with hairless pubic areas. So it's not surprising that that kind of became the norm in a lot of people's minds.
Right. The media definitely played a role, especially pornography, in kind of normalizing that specific look. But I think it's also important to remember that those images, they don't just exist in a vacuum. They're reflecting and also reinforcing these existing societal pressure that are put on women to conform to certain beauty standards.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's not just about men directly saying, hey, I prefer a smooth look. It's about all those subtle and not so subtle messages women get about what's considered attractive or desirable or even hygienic. And those messages, well, they can be super powerful.
Exactly. For a lot of women, the decision to remove pubic hair, it's not just about trying to please a partner. It's about dealing with those societal expectations and wanting to feel confident in their own bodies.
Yeah, and that pressure can be so intense, especially when you consider how those beauty standards are. Like, constantly changing what's in today could be out tomorrow. It's exhausting.
Totally. It's a never-ending cycle. And a lot of times it leads to women feeling like they have to constantly change their bodies to fit these, well, pretty arbitrary standards.
It's like chasing this ideal that's always just out of reach. And that can be so damaging to our self-esteem and our body image.
Right. So it's important to step back and think critically about those messages we're bombarded with and challenge that idea that there's only one right way to look.
Definitely. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that men, they're not immune to these pressures either. Even though this deep dive is focused on men's preferences, men also get all those messages about what's considered attractive when it comes to their own body hair.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The pressures might look a little different, but the underlying message is often the same: conform to these standards, or else you risk being seen as less attractive.
Right, so it's pretty clear that these preferences, they're not just random personal whims. They're formed by this whole mix of historical trends, cultural norms, and media influences, right? And honestly, it can be tough to separate those things, to figure out what's what.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even something as personal as our preferences, they're still connected to the world around us and shaped by all these bigger forces.
So where do we go from here? How do we navigate this complicated world of preferences and expectations and societal pressures? It's a lot.
I think the first step is just being aware, recognizing that these influences exist and that they affect both men and women. And then from there, it's about having those open and honest conversations with our partners, talking about what we like, what makes us insecure, what helps us feel comfortable and confident, just communicating.
Communication is key, right? You can't just assume you know what your partner wants or how they feel about things. Got to talk about it.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time thing either. Our bodies change over time, our preferences evolve, our relationships grow and deepen. So keep having those conversations, be curious, and adapt to each other's needs as you go.
It's about building that foundation of trust and respect, where both partners feel comfortable being themselves, expressing themselves, and being honest about their feelings.
Exactly. And that's a beautiful thing.
Now, before we jump into the final part of our deep dive, just a quick reminder to our listeners, we love hearing from you. If this conversation is sparking any thoughts or questions, head over to our YouTube channel, Shauna Polage, and leave us a comment. We're always up for some good discussion.
And if you're digging this deep dive, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Voices of the Soul for more insightful explorations like this one. We've got some really interesting topics coming up that you won't want to miss.
Now, in our last part, we're going to shift gears a bit and focus on how these preferences and all the pressure that comes with them, how they actually impact relationships and intimacy. Get ready to get real.
We'll be exploring the importance of communication, mutual respect, and how powerful it can be to embrace both our own choices and our partner's choices when it comes to body image and intimacy. It's going to be good.
It's going to be good. Don't miss it. All right, welcome back to Voices of the Soul. We've explored the history, the cultural influences, all the different opinions out there. But now it's time to get down to, well, the nitty-gritty. How do these pubic hair preferences actually play out in real-life relationships? When you're with someone.
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? It's one thing to talk about it in theory, but when you're actually with a partner, well, things can get a little more complicated.
For sure. Because let's face it, not all preferences are going to perfectly align, right? Sometimes you and your partner might have different ideas about, well, the whole pubic hair situation.
Right, exactly. So the question is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you navigate those differences without, causing any friction?
Yeah, how do you make sure everyone feels comfortable and respected, even if you don't see eye to eye on the landscaping down there?
I think the most important thing really is communication. And I know we've said it before, but it's worth repeating. You can't just assume you know what your partner likes or expects. You got to talk about it.
Definitely. And not just talk about it, but really listen. Listen to your partner's perspective, even if it's different from your own, and try to understand where they're coming from.
100%. It's about creating a space where both of you feel safe to express yourselves, without feeling judged or rejected or pressured to do something you're not comfortable with.
Right. It should be a conversation, not a dictatorship.
Exactly. And remember, it's not a one-time conversation either. Preferences can change over time, just like everything else in a relationship. What you liked 5 years ago, maybe you don't like it anymore, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, people change, bodies change, so you got to keep those lines of communication open and be willing to adapt to each other's evolving, tastes and desires.
Absolutely. It's about checking in with each other, being curious, and remembering that, well, your partner can't read your mind.
Right. So and this goes both ways, right? It's not just about women conforming to what they think men want. Men need to be mindful of their partner's feelings too. Considerate of what makes her feel good.
Absolutely. It's about being willing to compromise, to maybe try new things, to prioritize your partner's comfort and pleasure, even if it means putting your own preferences aside sometimes.
So what happens if those preferences really clash? Like what if you're, I don't know, super pro-bush and your partner is all about the smooth look, or vice versa? How do you handle that?
Well, that's when you really got to put in the work, you know? Can you find a middle ground that feels okay for both of you? Can you respect each other's choices, even if they're not exactly what you would choose?
Yeah, it's about remembering that your partner is a whole person, with their own set of preferences and experiences. And sometimes love means accepting those parts of them, even the parts that don't necessarily fit your, I don't know, your initial fantasy.
Yeah, and that's the foundation of a strong relationship, really. It's about going beyond those superficial preferences, the surface level stuff, and building something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect and understanding and, a willingness to meet each other halfway.
It's about loving the whole person, bush and
Yeah,
all.
yeah, exactly. And sometimes those differences, they can even become a source of, well, excitement and exploration in a relationship. It's about finding ways to play with those differences, to maybe tease each other a little, to try new things together, to keep things interesting.
So it's not about erasing those differences. It's about navigating them together with a sense of humor and an open mind, right?
Right, because in the end, it's not about the hair, it's about the connection. It's about creating a relationship where you both feel seen, heard, and respected for who you are, all of you.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the somewhat hairy world of pubic hair preferences, I think the biggest takeaway is that communication, respect, and a dash of humor can go a long way.
And don't forget, whether you're team bush, team smooth, or somewhere in between, the most important thing is to be true to yourself, to be open with your partner, and to build relationships that are rooted in trust and understanding.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. If you're still curious and have any thoughts or questions, head over to our YouTube channel, Shauna Polage, and leave us a comment. I'd love to hear from you.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to Voices of the Soul for more deep dives into the topics that matter most. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.